I will be really surprised if someone can guess where this tree is from. Sup, y'all? So for this devlog, I wanted to focus on some refactoring, updating the sampler, adding some grass, and then doing some improvements, for example, to the camera, and also adding a skybox and adding a sun and directional lighting. And then finally, I had to fix the terrain with lighting, which I'll show in a bit. To improve the sampling a bit, the first thing I did was remove the way I was encoding the position data of the entities in the world, which was in an image, which is bad for a few reasons, but for me, more importantly, it reduces the granularity of the position data, meaning I can't quite pick where I want to position them outside of how the pixels align in the terrain. And also, I can't encode any orientation information. So to fix this, I basically serialize them out to JSON, basically a list of entities per model type. So here we have a snippet of the JSON. And as you can see, these are just a list of entities that are of type tree3, which is this is the specific model that's being rendered. And we have an XYZ position. And these positions are relative to the terrain. So currently there's only one terrain in the game. So the world origin and the origin of the terrain align along with the basis vectors. So these are technically in the world coordinate space here. But then also we have the WXYZ, which represents the orientation of the model. Since the orientation is ordered in quaternions, I had to write a little bit of code for basically creating the quaternion and also being able to load the quaternion and turn it back into a rotation matrix so I could calculate the transform. In graduate school, I studied quaternions a bit, but I still haven't built up a good intuition about them. After switching the data around, first time rendering, this is what I ended up with, which is not exactly what I wanted. After making some tweaks, it's starting to look a little better, but still not correct. So after I got the trees and things placed where I would expect them, I decided to add a grass model, and I don't really like the way the grass looks, to be honest. I made something simple, and I'm using the same sampling as I do with the trees and rocks. I just increase the parameters so they sample more frequently. But in other games, I see that the grass is sort of more clumped together and it looks more organic. Here, it kind of just, I don't know, looks a bit odd. But for now, I'm going to keep it. So while looking at the grass, I noticed that the grass was sort of poking into areas a little bit that it shouldn't. So I set up a little test where I had just a black and white image, and the rocks should be rendered on the black side of the image, not the white side. And I noticed, as you can see here, that the sampling is kind of picking some places outside of where it should. Eventually, I found the problem, and as we can see here, the sampling is working much better. After the sampling was improved, I wanted to fix the camera with the goal of stopping the clipping through the ground. I thought the camera would be kind of easy to do, but actually pretty challenging. And I spent some time on it, and I think it still sucks. It no longer clips, but the camera, as it gets close to the ground, is changing position frequently, which causes sort of a lot of noise. I will revisit this in the future when I add collision detection, but I didn't want to get too tied down now with it. While working on the camera, I did have a couple interesting little issues. After the camera stopped clipping, I added a skybox using a cube map in OpenGL, and I've heard I could create a mesh dome and map a texture to it using spherical coordinates, but this seemed easier. I took a few of my kids' drawings and I decided to use them as the skybox for testing. The first go of it didn't come out too well. So the next thing I wanted to do was go outside and take a picture and attempt to create the skybox myself. However, the difficult part are the seams that are created when I try to cut out the faces of the cube. So to do this, I went in GIMP and I uploaded the image, and I basically cut out 512 by 512 squares and just offset them one at a time and tried to map them to how the skybox would work as far as OpenGL cube maps go. So if you look at this image, this is the original image I took. I have the different axes of the skybox, and I've also labeled what image they relate to, basically the order in which I took them. And these green lines show the seams that will be created. So between 1 and 4, there's no seam there, it's perfectly smooth. But between left of 2 and top of 1, there is a seam that can be seen. So what I tried to do in GIMP was try to basically clone the pixels from one edge to the other and then smudge them. So when they come together, they aren't as obvious. But this didn't work that well. Ultimately, I could spend more time and try to smudge and tweak them, or maybe use some free Skybox images, but for now I'm okay with it, and in the future it'll be easy to swap them out. After the Skybox was wrapped up, I decided I wanted to add directional lighting to mimic the sun. I used the Phong lighting model because I've implemented it in the past, and for me it was something that I could wrap my head around. The difference being this time that instead of using a normal per vertex, I'm using a face normal for all the vertices to give that low poly look. Again, most things will probably change whenever I start to actually worry about polishing, but for now, I thought it was okay. And my first attempt, as you can see, the light direction was actually backwards, which I thought was funny. Swapping it around, it looks a bit better. And right now I'm only doing lighting on the instanced objects, so the terrain objects. I then add lighting to the character and kind of makes him look a bit goofy, I would say. So finally I went to add the lighting to the terrain, but the normals are not correct and it's also doing smooth shading. So what I had to do was, which is probably not the best way to do it, but I basically duplicated the vertices for every triangle and gave them the face normal. This gave, again, that low poly look, but it's looking a bit voxely, I think if that's the right word. The next thing I want to start working on, I believe, is going to be the multiplayer aspect, or at least the networking. I don't want to put that off too long, as I think it'll be harder to integrate once I have more systems that I need to integrate with. I'm currently building a little home server that I'm going to use for a couple things, but I also use for sort of a simulated cloud provider. So I can run Docker and test actual deployment off my machine and maybe test some networking and perhaps have someone that I trust connect to it and see if they can run around or whatever the case. But that's kind of far away, I believe. Anyways, thank you for watching the video. Take care.